Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kim Coble. I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland League of Conservation Voters, and it's great to have you join us today for what I know will be a robust conversation. We are honored and pleased to have Senator Van Hollen join us today. And Senator, we know your schedule is packed, so for you to take time out today really means a lot to us. We're also joined today by Eric Galley, who's a true blue feet on the ground lobbyist. So we're going to have a great conversation. I want to let you know today, we have heard, we're going to be talking about federal funding, but we've heard about the infrastructure bill. We've heard about Build Back Better. We've heard Build Back Better's dead, but then we've heard there's some hopeful aspects that maybe some of it will come back again. We've heard states could be getting billions of dollars into our coffers. We've heard that Maryland's looking at that, but none of the dollars have been allocated. So we decided, let's go to the experts. And we have Senator Van Hollen and we have Eric Galley, and they're going to help us pull these apart and really understand where we are. The hope is that you walk out today with a better understanding of where federal funding is in Maryland, what we can anticipate, but more importantly, what you can do. We want you to gain a sense of urgency and inspiration to take action to help Maryland achieve the goals, the environmental goals that these dollars are meant to drive. So the way it's going to work is I'm going to ask the Senator and Eric some questions. But we have a fair amount of time today for you to ask questions. Given the size of the audience today, what we're going to do is have you type your questions in the chat, and we will try to get to as many as we can. So as you think of something, go ahead and type it in, and then we'll pick those up at the end here. So let me start with a quick introduction. If you don't know Senator Chris Van Hollen, you should. He is our U.S. Senator. He's been a Senator since 2017. He serves on the Senate Appropriations Committee, the Senate Budget Committee, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. He was a U.S. Representative from Congressional District 8 between 2003 and 2017. And prior to that, he was a member of the Maryland General Assembly. He has a long history of knowing how to work in a legislative body, but more importantly, he's a fantastic person to work with. And we, as conservationists, have had the honor and privilege of working with him for a long time. He has a lifetime score for his work in Maryland from Maryland LCV of 97%. And from our national partners at LCV, he has a lifetime score of 98%. So an environmental champion is really what we should be calling him. And he represents his state very well, and we're grateful he's here. Eric Galley is celebrating his 28th year of lobbying in Maryland. He has gone through a lot of shoes in those 28 years. He has clients that include the American Cancer Society, the National Center for Tobacco-Free Kids, and the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Full disclosure, we have him on contract representing us this year in hopes of really making sure Maryland is postured for these federal funds. He knows all the great lunch joints and places that the legislators hang out that nobody else knows. So he's a really great lobbyist to have on board. So pleased to welcome the Senator and Eric with us today. Let me start with Senator Van Hollen. So as I started, our understanding is that the Build Back Better package is dead, that is not going anywhere. But we also have heard that there are hopes that some of these elements of it can get pulled apart and will be pulled apart and will advance. So just amongst us, give us a sense of really what's going on with the bills or the bill, what the viability is, and what we can hope for in Maryland, specifically around climate.
So Kim, first of all, let me thank you and Maryland LCV for all your really important and good work in the state of Maryland on the Chesapeake Bay, on addressing the climate crisis, on working to generate more clean energy jobs in our state. I just salute all of you for the work that you've done with the Maryland General Assembly. It's great to be here with Eric Galley, who is very well versed in these issues, and I want to thank him for his efforts. I also want to introduce Shelby Prettyman, who's my point person on all things related to the environment. And I also see Marcia Replugan on here, who was my point person when I was in Annapolis, and many others who I've worked with over the years. So the bottom line is that the climate provisions of the Build Back Better agenda are not dead. When you hear people say, and I know Senator Manchin has said Build Back Better is dead, he's referring to the bill that came over from the House of Representatives, which has many, many, many different pieces to it. You know, I would like to pass the bill that came over from the House of Representatives. I think it's a really important piece of legislation, but we're not going to be able to pass that in the Senate as it is. We simply don't have the votes. And unfortunately, and this is not a partisan statement, it's just a statement of fact, we don't have any Republican senators supporting any aspects of this bill, which means we need all 50 Democratic senators to pass it under what we call budget reconciliation, which is a process that would allow us to pass it with 50 senators plus the vice president. The climate provisions are accepted by all 50 Democratic senators. And when I say the climate provisions, I should be clear, I'm talking about the significant investment of $550 billion in everything from clean energy tax credits to provisions that I've worked on for years to establish what's called a clean energy accelerator that is kind of like the Maryland, it's kind of like a green bank, to provisions that would help people provide more energy efficient homes, to more climate resiliency provisions. So the Build Back Better climate provisions are supported broadly by the Senate Democrats. And so I think we're in a good position there. The larger question will be whether we can get you know, enough of the elements together to pass something that can get over the finish line. I'm still very hopeful that we will. The timeline, I will say, is we're not talking weeks. We're probably talking, you know, at least maybe 2 months at this point. But with your help, we'll get it over the finish line.
So we can be hopeful, right? There's reason to be optimistic.
I do think there's a better than 50-50 chance that we'll be successful at passing the climate provisions from the Build Back Better agenda. And there were some differences on policies, and there remain some disagreements on policies. But in terms of the investment of $550 billion to deploy clean energy much more quickly and address some of the other issues, there is consensus there. It's just a question of getting everybody to put it up for a vote and get it over the finish line.
I have a technical question. I have an overarching question. So here's the technical one. $550 billion. How is it determined how much each state gets? Whose decision is that? Is it something we can influence? Where and when does that decision get made?
So, Kim, you mentioned earlier the infrastructure modernization bill, and I'm happy to go back to that because a lot of that bill contains formula funding for the states. With respect to the climate provisions of Build Back Better, it's a little less clear exactly what goes on a monies will come to the states, but they're not necessarily block grants to the states like there are in the infrastructure bill. A lot of the clean energy provisions or the climate provisions in the Build Back Better agenda relate to tax incentives for the much more rapid deployment of clean energy, tax incentives to encourage more Americans to purchase electric cars. In fact, if you look at the $550 billion in that provision, about 350 billion of it goes to different forms of tax incentives to encourage the deployment of clean energy and things like that. Now, there are other parts of it. I mentioned something I've been working on, which we call the Clean Energy Accelerator, the Green Bank. That's about $20 billion. And the funds there would actually travel through the EPA through a grant process. There's another provision I've worked on that's in the bill right now that would provide funds to help people make their homes more energy efficient and, help underwrite the more electric appliances. That will come through state energy offices, the way the structure there works. So those monies will come through the state in some form. But there are also a lot of programs that are national programs that will be determined by competitive grants, so that we make sure that the highest and best use is put to those monies in terms of the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I should finally add, there are some very important provisions in both bills regarding environmental justice in addressing legacy pollution that has hit lower income and in many cases minority communities much harder.
Thank you. That's actually very helpful to hear. So going in the other direction of kind of an overarching, as I started out my intro, we're very fortunate to have a senator's that understands the urgency of the climate crisis, that understands the importance that the environment plays to our economy, to our well-being, and your love and respect and care of the Chesapeake Bay is long known. Do you, what is your sense that of the other members of Congress? So on average, do you feel that the urgency that we're facing with the climate crisis is understood and appreciated, or is that still a point of education, an opportunity for education?
So let me distinguish between investments to help protect the Chesapeake Bay and issues to address the climate crisis, which of course also has an impact on the Bay. When it comes to funds, federal funds to protect the Bay, we've been very successful, Senator Cardin, myself, other members of the Maryland delegation, in getting bipartisan support for those funds. And we've, even during the period of the Trump administration, when Trump tried to cut dramatically, in fact, at one point tried to zero out the EPA's Chesapeake Bay program, we were able to increase funding. And as part of the infrastructure modernization bill, we included over $250 million in federal dollars for Bay cleanup. That's on top of the annual money. So we've been successful there on a bipartisan basis. Sadly, when it comes to the climate crisis, we've not had the bipartisan support for that. Back in around 2006, I remember Senator McCain was a great champion of dealing with climate change. Unfortunately, the politics in today's Republican Party have changed dramatically, and we don't have Republican support today for the climate provisions that in Build Back Better that we were just talking about. I mean, if we tried to break those out of the bill and just put them up for a vote through the normal process, unfortunately, we would not get probably any Republican support at this time. So, and you saw, of course, former President Trump withdraw from the Paris Agreement. So this is just, unfortunately, and I should say, this is in Washington. I think if you talk to many people of all political persuasions in Maryland, around the country, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, most would agree that we need to deal with we need to work on reducing greenhouse emissions and deal with the climate crisis. I will say, Kim, there is more bipartisan support in dealing with the resiliency issues and the impact of climate, whether it's, like Annapolis, where We're working to provide some federal funding just to help raise the dock, part of the mayor's plan, working with the county executive there as well. So there is more bipartisan support to deal with the harmful impacts of climate change. I wish there was more bipartisan support to deal with the causes, because ultimately that's obviously we're going to have to address that issue in an urgent way. As you say, this is urgent. And that's why we really are pushing to pass those climate provisions and Build Back Better.
Ooh, wow. Thus the daunting tasks in front of us. Thank you, Senator. So Eric, I want to turn to you because assuming we're going to get the money out of Congress that we need and that we're asking for at some point, Maryland needs to be ready to use those funds. They need, the state, the local governments need to be able to grab the funds and start implementation. So tell us a little bit about what we're doing to make sure that that's the case, and give us some prediction about how do you feel like Maryland's in a good position?
Well, it's a very interesting time because as this money is going to start to come down, we're going to be leaving one administration and going into another administration. So there certainly will be issues around that. We've been meeting with legislative leadership talking about it. As you know, many groups have gotten together and they asked us to prioritize some budget items that if things were coming and we had some choice, what were some of our priorities? And we're going to have a little bit of a run through with the infrastructure bill. So we're going to have a little bit of practice there, even though, as the senator said, that's a lot more channeled than this program will be. It's a large program. I'm sure, it won't be perfect on day one, but I do believe that in the 2 or 3 year period that we're going with this, and I think that they'll be able to carry it out. I do.
So your sense is that Maryland's posturing itself to utilize those funds?
Yeah, we've had a lot of meetings with leadership in the legislature, and they're certainly getting ready and trying to figure out how they would dole it out and how they would do it on a year-to-year basis, because our legislature is going to gain much more power after next year with a constitutional change we had to deal with the budget more directly. So this year, the governor has almost all of the power, as governors have had in Maryland up to this point. Starting next year, the legislature is getting ready to do a lot of these things. But the agencies, obviously will have to get going. Yeah. I'm pretty confident that we're a very competent state, and I'm pretty confident that we'll get the money spent properly and we'll get things going.
And you raise a good point. In November, we have our statewide elections, and every state office is up, including for obviously the governor and lieutenant governor. So for those of you that are here as conservation voters, that's a real important aspect of how you vote, is where they are with on conservation issues. And we can talk more about that later, but just want to make that point. Feel free to put questions in the chat, and we can keep chatting here, but
Kim, if I could, as we wait for questions, I do want to say a word about the infrastructure modernization bill, because you've been focused primarily on the Build Back Better agenda and the climate provisions. But I do want to stress that there's lots of money that is already coming to the state under the infrastructure modernization bill. So first of all, big picture, over the next 5 years, Maryland will get $7 billion in everything from repairing bridges to transit, which obviously has an important impact on climate, to water and sewer funds that have an important impact on the health of the Bay. So, for example, in that bill over the next 5 years, there'll be close to $1 billion in water infrastructure to help with sewage treatment plants and other water infrastructure issues. There also will be, in terms of the transit money, there is $1.8 billion in transit money. Obviously, that has an important air quality, air pollution, and climate benefit, depending on how you make those investments. On top of that, Maryland will be getting $63 million in formula funding for these electric vehicle charging stations, which obviously has a direct impact on climate, and also $94 million to reduce transportation-related emissions. So that's in formula funding that is going to be coming to the state for sure. Now, on top of that, that infrastructure modernization bill contains substantial national funds that Maryland as a state or local jurisdictions or individual entities can apply for as part of a competitive bidding process. And so I want to highlight that as well, because there are literally billions of dollars in those funds that will be accessible by Maryland through the competitive process. And we do want to work with you on identifying those programs, including environmental justice programs and a range of resiliency programs. So bottom line, billions of dollars will definitely flow through the state through formula funding. On top of that, billions of dollars that the state can access, jurisdictions can access through the competitive bidding process to address climate-related issues.
Excellent point, Senator. Thank you. And just to emphasize the importance of this, transportation is the leading source of greenhouse gas emissions in Maryland. So building our transit system is critical. Building EV, electric vehicle structure, is critical if we're going to really meet the climate reduction goals that we have. So very important. Let's see.
Kim, I would just say again, the Senate President and the Speaker, I'm very pleased that they have actually invited LCV and a few other environmental groups to work with the community. And again, they're listening to us and we're giving them lists of how to do things. And it's been a great dialogue so far on how to spend.
Good point. Yes. Yeah. The Senate and the House leadership, I think, have been very strong on this issue this year. So let's see. I've got some questions. Julia, thank you. Will the infrastructure modernization bill focus on converting coal-fired power plants to natural gas generation and or renewables? So is that part of the infrastructure bill?
So the infrastructure bill, that piece of the puzzle is a greater focus of the Build Back Better agenda, and again, primarily through incentives to build, cleaner energy facilities. And I mentioned, that of that $550 billion, $350 billion is in various forms of tax credit. Some are for individuals, as I mentioned, to purchase an electric vehicle, but others are to accelerate the conversion of our electricity production toward more renewable and cleaner forms of energy. But the infrastructure modernization bill does have, so that is the focus of, that is more the focus of the Build Back Better piece than the other one. And it goes back a little bit to your question, Kim, on unfortunately, the lack of bipartisan support is because, we do think in order to meet, we all know, in order to meet the scientific dictates of Mother Nature, we need to accelerate that transition. But we have a lot of members who don't want to be part of that, accelerating that transition.
Yeah. One question, Senator, I know you and I had this conversation earlier on a call, but it's an important one. And that is that the whole Build Back Better package, the original one the House passed, as you said, you're supportive, and it includes really key provisions that are going to advance this country. As it gets pulled apart, some of those are going to get lost or put aside or delayed, if you will. And I remember you were reassuring about that, but you also talked about the need to not let the perfect be the enemy of the really good. And maybe if you could just make a comment or two about that.
Right. As I said, I support the bill that came out of the House of Representatives, and it has meets a lot of important national priorities. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get them through the Senate. I mean, one that Senator Manchin and others have been very public about is that they don't support the provisions in that bill on paid family leave. That's just one example. I support those provisions, but when you're in a Senate where you've got no Republican Senate support for this, obviously you need every one of your 50 Democratic senators. And so at the end of the day, I do believe we should push to include as much of the House bill as we can, but we cannot make the perfect the enemy of the good, because the alternative is getting none of this,
Right.
None, and the clock is ticking. And so the provisions from the House bill where I think we have sort of broad consensus among Democrats in the Senate are, number one, the climate provisions, at least the amount of the investment. Number two, reducing the cost of prescription drugs, which is something many of us fought for years, giving Medicare the power to negotiate reductions in drug prices. I think we have agreement on reducing the cost of childcare, quality childcare, and we want to move forward on that front, and also on some of the universal early education provisions. Again, something many of us have been fighting for many years. We're also trying to salvage some piece of the child tax credit, which helped cut childhood poverty in half last year, and we obviously would like to keep that going. But those are some of the provisions where there may be agreement. The good news is, for this conversation, is the climate provisions in terms of the investment really are among the least controversial among the 50 Democrats in the Senate.
That's excellent news. Well, we're coming up to the wrap up time, so I'm going to ask Eric and the Senator one closing question here, and that is, this is coming in from our participants as well. Those of us on this call care deeply about the issue of climate. We're committed people working on it. So what can we as conservation voters do to support getting a strong bill with lots of funding through Congress and into Maryland? And Eric, I'm going to start with you so you can address the Maryland focus to that question.
Well, the most important thing we can do, and that's a short-term thing for this bill, but in the long run, the most important thing we can do is to track our legislators and our governors and see what they're doing on this issue. We're in the middle of a gubernatorial race, and certainly getting a good governor who really cares about the environment and these issues will be very, very important, because even though the funding structure is going to change next year, the implementation of these plans is going to be so important. So it's so important to elect a governor who has the spirit and the intent and the desire to do this as good as possible, and legislators who will help allocate it as well. And I know that goes beyond the actual enactment of the Build Back Better, but electing the right people is always, electing more Chris Van Hollens is the most important thing we can do for all of our great causes.
Thank you, Eric. Well said. And Senator, I'll let you close us out here.
Well, I appreciate that, Eric. Thank you for that comment. But to all of you, let me thank you. And I think the most important thing that Maryland LCV can do right now in terms of the Build Back Better agenda is to work with your partners in other states and be sort of force multipliers with them, and just keep the pressure on in terms of getting these pieces together, making sure that the perfect is not the enemy of the good. And I think a lot of us would agree with a lot of the provisions that came out of the House bill, but at the end of the day, we've got to take what the votes provide for, or we'll get nothing. And we need everybody to fully understand that. We'll have to come back and fight another day on some of the other pieces, but let's get this over the finish line, and we could use that broad national coalition that Maryland LCV is a part of. And then, in the longer term, to Eric's point regarding Maryland and elections, we sure could use some reinforcements in the Senate from other states with respect to getting the votes on these important national issues. Again, that we just want to support people who support the issues that we're fighting for. And climate, as everyone on this call knows better than anybody, is urgent. It's not our clock. We don't control the clock here. We control the amount of pollution and carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions we put in the atmosphere together with other countries, and we need to continue to work urgently on that front.
Well said, Senator. And again, on behalf of all of us, thank you. We're proud to have you representing us, and anything we can do, let us know.
Thanks for all you do.
Thank you. And to everybody that's joined the call today, we really appreciate it. If there's a take-home message here, it is about the nexus of the environment and politics. And that's what Maryland LCV is all about. That's exactly where we work. We try to get folks elected that are going to advance environmental policies. The importance of that can't be overstated. I think based on today's conversation, it's really been highlighted. So we look forward to working with you throughout this session, in the next couple months on Build Back Better, and throughout this year as we work on the election in November. So all to say, let's lock arms, stay tuned, and if you need more information, we'll be having it. So thank you all. We'll see you next week, when I believe we're talking about conservation financing and what role does the private sector have in this? How can they help advance environmental goals? We've talked about the federal government, we've talked about state government, local. What about the private sector? How do we get them engaged? So that's next week. In the meantime, have a great week, and thanks for joining us. Bye now.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.